In this segment, we're going to talk about data privacy, an issue of increasing importance in today's world, especially with the regulations that are coming, and how it affects the design of medical software. So you will have seen many examples of this online. So here's just a random story from TechCrunch. It says 1 billion medical images are exposed online as doctors ignore warnings. And this was a result of an unsecure pack system allowing data leakage and people could access things. And security was not necessarily the highest level, implement the highest level in many hospitals. They relied on having a firewall outside to protect from intrusion, but inside everything was open. So if you could get access, you could get access to 1 million images, as the slide shows. When it comes to privacy in the United States, the word you'll often hear is the word HIPAA. And the word HIPAA strikes fear in many people at the hospital. People are always worried about the HIPAA office. Getting a call from the HIPAA office is actually worse than getting a call from almost anywhere else. The legal situation is pretty significant. HIPAA stands for a piece of legislation in the United States called the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. This is what survived of a much more comprehensive attempt to reform healthcare in the United States at the time, and this is the piece that made it. There are two key terms you'll hear in the context of HIPAA, the word PHI, Protected Health Information, and the acronym ePHI, Electronic Protected Health Information. These are the things you have to be mindful of. A more general term you'll also hear is the word PII, the acronym PII, Personally Identifiable Information. And you'll also hear terms such as de-identification and anonymization. And this, in crude form, is the removal of ePHI from a digital data set so that you cannot identify a subject. So let's get into this a little bit more. What is protected health information and how does HIPAA come into play? This is from a code, from a guidance from the Department of Health and Human Services in the United States. Health information, ePHI, is stuff that you can use as a reasonable basis to believe that can be identify the individual. So the name, of course, is one of them. This includes things like past, present, or future physical or mental health conditions of the individual, records of provision of healthcare to the individual, past, present, or future payments for the provision of healthcare to the individual. For example, credit card statements will, of course, identify the individual. When we think about ePHI, there's this usual list of 18. So here's a list that I got from the Keck Center at Yale. So the name of the patient obviously identifies the patient, the address, all elements of the patient's dates, including years that relate to individual, telephone numbers, fax numbers, email address, social security number, medical record number, health plan beneficiary number, account numbers, and even other things such as certificate and license number, vehicle identifiers, device identifiers, web URLs, IP addresses, biometric identifiers, including finger or voice prints, full face photographic images, obviously, and any other, and this is the casual here, unique identifying number, characteristic, or code. So any of these things in a data set can be used to identify a patient, and you have to be careful to keep such information under lock and key, and hence the graphic at the top left corner, to safeguard the patient's privacy. For example, you don't want news about a patient having a particular procedure becoming public. It may impact their ability to get work or be elected to public office or all kinds of things like that. What are the implications of HIPAA for software design? The implication, we don't want to store anything at the bare minimum of patient data and store it in such a way that does not constitute ePHI. We often identify data with a private identifier that maps to a real patient. And just as a reminder, HIPAA applies both to medical entities and business associates of medical entities, so claims processing companies, data conversion companies, etc. And this is part of a recent reform. So the goal here and the significance here is that you need to design your software in such a way that we minimize how much data we store about a patient in our own system. So typically, we may keep just a simple patient number that maps to the real patient ID, and then we use that to index into another database to get the actual information. But on your computer, you want to keep as little information as possible. The basic principle here is you want to authenticate and encrypt. You want to store everything encrypted, and you want to authenticate all connections to the system. And we'll talk about that more in the context of cybersecurity. Now, this sets up these implied principles from HIPAA become much more explicit when we look at the European regulation, the GDPR. And we'll come back to GDPR in a minute. But first, let's talk about anonymization. This is the procedures that are set forth to anonymize data, to remove ePHI. We often need to anonymize data both for research purposes and for other storage in such a way as so that it lowers the risk, essentially. So there are two basic methods for anonymization. One is called safe harbor, and the other is called expert determination. Now, safe harbor is the simplest. The 18 types of identifiers are removed from the data, and as such, an individual cannot be re-identified. You strip out all the information related to the patient, you get raw data, and that's the extent of it. Expert determination, in expert determination, we try to preserve a little bit more of the data because we may need it for some kind of study. So here the process goes, the expert examines the data and they demonstrate that the risk of someone receiving the data being able to identify an individual is very small. So for example, instead of having the age in the data set, we may replace 45 with 40 to 50 here. And this, now if we have enough people in our data set 40 to 50, this data set is hard to map to an individual. But if we're doing a clinical study and we're using this data in a research setting, for example, and we want to compare the outcomes in populations, say, younger than 40 to those older than 40, this 40 to 50 tagging allows us to continue with our study. We have enough information to do what we need to do without actually being able to identify an individual subject. This is part of the process of data minimization we'll hear about also in the context of GDPR. So GDPR is the European regulation. It's called the General Data Protection Regulation. This came into effect a few years ago, and this applies to a lot more than just medical data. All of you will have had the experience of going to a web page and getting a warning that we store cookies and things like that. This is a result of GDPR. So the notion of protected data in GDPR is much broader than in HIPAA, and the goal of GDPR is to force entities, companies that hold personal data, to design privacy protections as a core feature, not as an afterthought. It applies to more than medical data, and it applies to all entities holding or using personal data of EU residents regardless of their location. So a company in the United States, a web page in the United States, which shows cookies that contain information of citizens in the EU is bound by GDPR. So what is personal data? This is GDPR Article 4. Personal data means any information relating to an identified or unidentifiable natural person, a data subject. An identifiable natural person is one who can be identified directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier such as, and please note that these lists are not meant to be exclusive. These are examples. A name, an identification number, location data, an online identifier, one or more factors specific to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, social identity of the natural person. So here we're now getting out into the cultural identity of a person. So this is a general data protection regulation, not just a medical regulation. And the goal of the GDPR is to force companies, software developers to use privacy by design and by default. So privacy is not something we worry about at the end of the design process. It's something that comes in at the beginning of the design process. We must ensure that only personal data which are necessary for each specific purpose of the processing are processed. We shouldn't be looking at other data that we don't need. And this applies to the amount of data collected, to the extent of their processing, the storage period, and who has access to it. The fact that the company has access to data doesn't mean that everybody in the company should have access to data. We have to be mindful of that. And personal data, and this is a critical component, must not be made accessible to others without the individual's intervention. Even though we have it in our software, we may need it for a specific task, and if somebody's accessing the system for a task other than that, they shouldn't have access to that particular thing. So we need internal controls here. We want to handle data with care. So all these data privacy concerns are becoming particularly important because data is the key to machine learning. So a major challenge in machine learning is having large amounts of training data. We need to ensure, as I mentioned before, diversity of population, of sensors, of environments. But questions come up here, like whose data are we talking about? What rights do the patients have? What precautions must one take to ensure patient privacy? And there are legal data privacy and security constraints, and especially when it comes to HIPAA, there's significant legal penalties to any leakage of personal patient data information. And so one of the things we have to keep in mind here is this concept of data privacy is in competition with the development of machine learning algorithms. A lot of these algorithms are actually fundamentally very simple. What makes a good algorithm better than a bad algorithm is just the amount of data we have. So that the data, the richness of the data, the extent of the data is almost the most important component of these algorithms. Somebody who has a slightly simpler algorithm but better data to train may often do better than somebody who has a better algorithm but less data. And if we have to keep all this amount of data around in order to train our algorithms, we have to safeguard that data and make sure that patients' private information doesn't leak because we mishandle data. So this will lead us now naturally to a discussion of this concept of cybersecurity, which we'll get to in the next segment.